The USS Charleston sat motionless in the Pacific Ocean, its massive hull cutting through the calm waters like a wounded giant. Captain Sarah Mitchell stood on the bridge, her weathered hands gripping the rail as she watched her crew scramble across the deck below. For 3 weeks, the Navy's most advanced destroyer had been plagued by a mysterious engine failure that had stumped every expert sent to fix it. The ship's main propulsion system would work perfectly for hours, then suddenly shut down without warning. The engines would go silent, leaving the massive vessel drifting helplessly until backup systems kicked in. It was a nightmare scenario for any naval commander, especially one carrying sensitive equipment worth millions of dollars. Admiral Richardson had already sent his best engineering teams aboard. These were men and women with decades of experience, armed with the latest diagnostic equipment and backed by the full resources of the Naval Engineering Command. They had run every test imaginable, replaced dozens of components, and even brought in specialists from the manufacturer. Yet the problem persisted, growing worse with each passing day. The crew was growing restless. These were seasoned sailors who had served in combat zones and weathered the worst storms the ocean could throw at them. But being stranded in the middle of the Pacific with a ship that could fail at any moment was testing everyone's nerves. The younger sailors whispered among themselves during mealtimes, wondering if they would have to abandon ship. Even the veteran officers were starting to show signs of stress. Captain Mitchell had received orders to return to port immediately, but every attempt to make significant progress toward home had been thwarted by the engine failures. The ship would make good time for several hours, building up speed and covering decent distance, then the engines would die again. The repeated stops and starts were not only frustrating but also dangerous, as they made the ship vulnerable and unpredictable. The engineering bay had become a constant hive of activity. Teams worked around the clock, pulling apart systems that had never given trouble before. Computer screens displayed endless streams of data, but none of it made sense. Every reading appeared normal right up until the moment everything shut down. It was as if the ship itself was rebelling against all attempts to understand what was wrong. Lieutenant Commander James Park, the ship's chief engineer, had barely slept in 2 weeks. His usually neat uniform was stained with grease and sweat, and his eyes were bloodshot from staring at technical manuals and diagnostic displays. He had built his entire career on his ability to solve mechanical problems, but this situation was unlike anything he had encountered. The failure seemed to follow no logical pattern, defying every principle of engineering he had learned. The pressure from above was mounting. Admiral Richardson called daily, demanding updates and solutions. The Pentagon was asking questions. The media had started to notice that one of the Navy's premier vessels was overdue at its destination. What had started as a routine technical problem was rapidly becoming a public relations disaster and a serious threat to national security. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a civilian contractor and one of the Navy's top propulsion experts, had flown in by helicopter just 3 days earlier. She brought with her a team of specialists and equipment so advanced that most of the crew had never seen anything like it. Her reputation preceded her. She was the woman who had solved the submarine crisis of 2019 and had personally designed improvements to half the fleet's propulsion systems. But even Dr. Chen seemed baffled. She had spent hours in the engine room, methodically checking every system, every connection, every component. Her equipment detected no anomalies. The engines were in perfect condition, according to every measurement they could take. Yet the failures continued, seemingly at random, as if the ship was being controlled by some invisible force. The crew watched from a distance as the experts worked, their confidence slowly eroding with each failed attempt to find a solution. These were the people they had been told could fix anything, the best minds the Navy had to offer. If they couldn't solve the problem, what hope was there? The vast ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, and home seemed farther away than ever. The helicopter touched down on the USS Charleston's flight deck, just as the sun was setting on another day of failed repairs. The rotors whipped salt spray across the deck as a lone figure stepped out, carrying nothing but a small duffel bag and a worn toolkit that looked like it had seen decades of use. The flight crew barely noticed him as he walked across the deck, just another specialist being brought in to attempt what others had failed to accomplish. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thompson had been retired for 8 years, spending his days restoring classic cars in his garage in San Diego. At 62, His hair was completely gray, and his face showed the lines that came from 30 years of naval service. He moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned that rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes at sea could be deadly. The call had come from Admiral Richardson himself. "Marcus, we need you back," the Admiral had said. "I know you're retired, but we have a situation that requires someone with your particular expertise." Thompson had served under Richardson 20 years earlier, and the Admiral knew that if anyone could solve an impossible mechanical problem, it was Marcus Thompson. Thompson's reputation in the Navy was legendary. Though most of the current crew had never heard of him, he was the man who had fixed the aircraft carrier Enterprise when it lost power during a typhoon in 1998. He had solved the submarine rescue crisis that the Navy preferred not to talk about publicly. He had a gift for understanding machines that went beyond textbooks and training manuals. Captain Mitchell met him at the flight deck, her expression a mixture of hope and skepticism. She had been told that this retired chief might be able to help, but looking at the elderly man with his simple toolkit, she wondered what he could possibly do that teams of experts with millions of dollars of equipment had failed to accomplish. "Chief Thompson," she said, extending her hand, "thank you for coming aboard. I have to tell you, we've had the best people the Navy has to offer working on this problem for weeks." Thompson shook her hand with a firm grip. "Ma'am, sometimes the best people are so smart they overlook the simple things. Mind if I take a look at what's been done so far?" The briefing took place in the ship's conference room, with Dr. Chen and her team presenting their findings. Charts and graphs covered the walls showing every conceivable measurement and analysis. Computer models demonstrated how the engines should be working, and diagnostic reports filled thick binders. The presentation was impressive and thorough, covering every technical aspect of the propulsion system. Thompson listened quietly, occasionally nodding or asking a simple question. His questions seemed almost elementary to the assembled experts. Things like, "When did this first happen?" And "What was the weather like?" The specialists looked at each other with barely concealed impatience. These were basic questions that had nothing to do with the sophisticated analysis they had conducted. After the briefing, Thompson asked to see the engine room. Dr. Chen offered to give him a tour and explain the systems, but he politely declined. "I'd rather just look around by myself first, if that's all right," he said. "Sometimes it's better to see things with fresh eyes." The engine room was a cathedral of modern technology, filled with gleaming pipes, sophisticated control panels, and monitoring equipment that cost more than most people's houses. Thompson walked slowly through the space, not touching anything, just observing. The other engineers watched from a distance, whispering among themselves about what this old-timer thought he was going to find that they had missed. He spent nearly an hour just walking and looking, stopping occasionally to crouch down and examine something at floor level or to peer up at the overhead systems. He didn't take notes or use any instruments. He simply observed, taking in the subtle sounds, the way the light reflected off various surfaces, even the smell of the air in different parts of the engine room. Lieutenant Commander Park finally approached him. "Chief, is there anything specific you're looking for?" "We've documented every inch of these engines. I can show you whatever you need to see," Thompson smiled. "Son, I'm not looking for anything specific. I'm just trying to understand what this ship is trying to tell me. Every machine has a personality, and when something's wrong, it usually tries to let you know. You just have to know how to listen." The younger officer looked confused. This wasn't the scientific approach he was used to. Thompson's method seemed almost mystical compared to the data-driven analysis that had consumed the past 3 weeks. But there was something in the old chief's confidence that made Park want to believe that maybe, just maybe, this unconventional approach might yield results where sophisticated technology had failed. Thompson spent his first night aboard the USS Charleston in the engine room, much to the surprise of the night watch. While the rest of the ship settled into the quiet routine of evening watch, the retired chief sat cross-legged on the metal deck, his back against a warm pipe, simply listening. The young sailors on duty thought he might be having some kind of breakdown, but they had been ordered to give him whatever support he needed. The sounds of a ship at sea become as familiar as a heartbeat to experienced sailors. The subtle vibrations, the rhythm of the engines, the whisper of air through ventilation systems, all of these create a symphony that tells the story of a vessel's health. Thompson closed his eyes and let these sounds wash over him, searching for something that didn't belong. Around 2 in the morning, He heard it. It was so subtle that he almost missed it, a tiny metallic ping that occurred every few minutes, barely audible over the normal engine noise. He opened his eyes and stood up slowly, following the sound like a bloodhound tracking a scent. The ping seemed to come from somewhere near the main fuel pumps, but when he got close, it would stop. Dr. Chen found him there the next morning, lying on his back under a maze of pipes with a small flashlight, looking up at connections that her team had tested dozens of times. "Chief Thompson," she called out, "we've already checked every fitting in that section. All the connections are tight, pressure readings are normal." Thompson slid out from under the pipes, his uniform now as dirty as everyone else's. "I'm sure they are, ma'am, but I keep hearing something that shouldn't be there. It's like a tiny bell ringing, very faint. Have you heard anything like that?" Dr. Chen looked puzzled. "No, I haven't noticed any unusual sounds. Our acoustic monitoring equipment hasn't picked up any anomalies either." She gestured toward a sophisticated computer display that showed sound wave patterns in real time. If there was an irregular noise, this system would detect it. Thompson nodded politely but continued his investigation. He asked the sailors on watch to tell him exactly when they had noticed the engine failures occurring. Not the official times that went into reports, but when they personally first sensed something was wrong. He wanted to know about tiny changes in vibration, subtle shifts in sound, even changes in the smell of the air. The crew began to warm up to the old chief as words spread about his unconventional methods. Unlike the other experts who spoke in technical jargon and treated the enlisted sailors like they were invisible, Thompson talked to everyone like their opinion mattered. He asked the cooks if they had noticed any patterns in when the galley equipment would fluctuate with power changes. He questioned the communications specialists about whether they had detected any interference with their systems. Petty Officer Martinez, who worked in the communications center, mentioned something that made Thompson stop in his tracks. "You know, Chief, it's probably nothing, but about 10 minutes before each engine failure, we get this weird little blip on our radio equipment. It's like a tiny burst of static that lasts maybe half a second. We reported it, but the electronics specialist said it was probably just atmospheric interference." Thompson asked to see the communications center immediately. Martinez showed him the equipment and demonstrated how the static burst would appear on their monitors. It was indeed very brief and could easily be dismissed as normal radio interference. But Thompson was interested in the timing. He asked Martinez to pull up the log showing exactly when these bursts had occurred over the past 3 weeks. When they compared the timestamps of the radio interference with the engine failure log, a pattern emerged. The static burst occurred exactly 9 minutes and 47 seconds before each major engine shutdown. Not approximately exactly. This was not a coincidence, and it was definitely not atmospheric interference. Dr. Chen was skeptical when Thompson presented this information. "Chief, radio interference can't cause engine failure. These are completely separate systems. There's no connection between our communications equipment and the propulsion controls." She pointed to detailed schematics showing how the ship's systems were isolated from each other. But Thompson wasn't convinced that the systems were as separate as the blueprints suggested. Modern naval vessels were incredibly complex, with thousands of connections and interfaces that weren't always documented in the official plans. Ships were modified and upgraded constantly, and sometimes temporary fixes became permanent installations that were forgotten over time. He asked for the ship's complete modification history, every change that had been made since the vessel was first commissioned. Captain Mitchell was reluctant to provide this information to a retired chief petty officer, but Admiral Richardson had given Thompson complete access to whatever he needed. The modification files filled an entire filing cabinet and detailed hundreds of changes, upgrades, and repairs that had been made over the ship's service life. Thompson spread the files across a table in the ship's library and began reading through them methodically. Most of the modifications were routine, software updates, equipment replacements, safety improvements. But buried in the files from 18 months ago, he found something interesting. A communication system upgrade had required running new cables through the ship, and one of those cables had been routed near the engine control systems to save space and installation time. The modification had been approved and signed off on by all the appropriate departments. The installation met all safety requirements and had passed every inspection. According to the documentation, there should be no interaction between the communication cables and the engine controls. But Thompson had learned over 3 decades that what should happen and what actually happens are sometimes very different things. Thompson's theory sounded impossible to the assembled experts. Dr. Chen shook her head as she listened to his explanation. "Chief, that communication cable is shielded and carries only digital signals. Even if there was some kind of interference, the engine control system has multiple safeguards and backup circuits. A brief radio signal couldn't possibly cause a complete engine shutdown." Lieutenant Commander Park agreed with Dr. Chen. "We've tested every circuit in the engine control system. Everything is functioning perfectly. The shutdowns happen even when we disconnect the backup systems and run on primary controls only. There's just no way a communication cable could cause this kind of failure." But Thompson had seen enough impossible things during his career to know that systems could interact in ways that engineers never anticipated. He asked for permission to trace the physical path of the communication cable that had been installed 18 months earlier. It was a tedious process that required crawling through tight spaces and following cables through areas of the ship that most people never saw. The cable ran from the communication center down through 3 decks, then along a corridor that passed directly behind the main engine control panel. According to the installation specifications, it should have been separated from the engine control circuits by at least 6 inches and multiple layers of shielding. But when Thompson finally located the cable behind the control panel, he found something that made his blood run cold. The communication cable had been installed correctly, but 6 months later, during a routine maintenance procedure, someone had moved it. A repair team had needed access to a water pipe that ran behind the cable, and they had temporarily relocated the communication line to get it out of their way. When they finished their work, they had reinstalled the cable in a slightly different position, about 2 inches closer to the engine control circuits than it was supposed to be. The change was so minor that it had been overlooked during subsequent inspections. The cable was still properly secured, still met basic safety requirements, and appeared to be correctly installed unless someone measured the exact distance from the engine controls. It was the kind of small deviation that happens on every ship, every day, and usually causes no problems whatsoever. But Thompson suspected that those 2 inches might be making all the difference. The communication cable carried high-frequency digital signals that pulsed through it every time the ship's radio systems processed incoming messages. The engine control circuits used extremely sensitive electronic components that could potentially be affected by electromagnetic interference if the source was close enough and strong enough. Dr. Chen remained skeptical. Even if there is some interference, modern engine control systems are designed to filter out external signals. The computer should ignore anything that doesn't come from approved sources. She pulled up diagnostic screens showing the engine control system's status. Every indicator showed normal operation, with no signs of external interference or unexpected signals. Thompson asked a different question. What happens if the engine control computer receives a signal that it recognizes as valid but isn't supposed to be there? Dr. Chen paused, considering the implications. The engine control system was programmed to respond to specific commands from authorized sources, but it also had safety protocols designed to shut down the engines if it detected certain types of problems or received conflicting instructions. They spent the next hour reviewing the engine control software, looking for potential vulnerabilities. The system was incredibly sophisticated, with thousands of lines of code governing every aspect of engine operation. But buried deep in the safety subroutines, they found something troubling. If the control computer received what appeared to be a valid shutdown command from any source, it would immediately halt engine operation to prevent potential damage. The communication cable carried encrypted digital signals, but electromagnetic interference could potentially corrupt those signals in unpredictable ways. If a corrupted signal happened to match the pattern of a valid shutdown command, the engine control system would interpret it as a legitimate order and shut down the engines accordingly. The safety system that was designed to protect the ship was actually causing the problem. Testing this theory required careful coordination. Thompson asked Petty Officer Martinez to monitor the communication systems and announce exactly when the next radio burst would occur. Meanwhile, Dr. Chen prepared to observe the engine control systems with her most sensitive monitoring equipment, looking for any sign of unexpected signals or commands. The test came sooner than expected. The ship received a routine message from fleet headquarters, and Martinez immediately saw the telltale static burst on his displays.
"There it is, Chief,"
he called out. Dr. Chen watched her monitors intently, and for the first time in 3 weeks she saw something unusual. A brief spike appeared on her electromagnetic interference detector, lasting less than a second. 9 minutes and 47 seconds later, the engines shut down. The timing was too precise to be a coincidence. The electromagnetic pulse from the communication cable was somehow triggering the engine shutdown, but with a delay that had made it impossible to spot the connection. Thompson theorized that the corrupted signal was being processed through multiple layers of the engine control system software, each adding a small delay until the final shutdown command was executed. Captain Mitchell was amazed but still cautious. "Chief, if you're right about this, how do we fix it? We can't just disconnect our communication systems, and we can't afford to have the engines failing every time we receive a message." The ship was still stranded in the middle of the Pacific, and they needed a solution that would get them safely back to port. Thompson smiled for the first time since boarding the ship. "Ma'am, the fix should be pretty simple. We just need to move that communication cable back where it's supposed to be. 2 inches might not sound like much, but sometimes it's the difference between a working ship and a floating paperweight." Moving the communication cable proved to be more challenging than Thompson had anticipated. The space behind the engine control panel was cramped and filled with other systems that couldn't be disturbed. The cable had been secured with dozens of mounting brackets and ties, all of which had to be carefully removed without damaging anything else in the tightly packed area. Lieutenant Commander Park assembled a team of the ship's best technicians to assist with the delicate operation. They worked in shifts, with each person spending only short periods in the confined space to avoid fatigue and mistakes. Every movement had to be planned carefully, as a single error could damage critical systems and potentially leave the ship completely disabled. Dr. Chen insisted on monitoring the engine control systems throughout the operation. She positioned herself at the main diagnostic station, ready to alert the repair team if any of their work affected the ship's vital systems. Her equipment showed every fluctuation in electrical current, every change in system status, providing a real-time picture of the ship's health as the repair progressed. The most difficult part was determining exactly where the cable was supposed to be positioned. The original installation plans showed the specified location, but the actual space behind the control panel didn't match the blueprints exactly. Years of modifications and upgrades had changed the layout slightly, and what looked simple on paper became a 3-dimensional puzzle in reality. Thompson crawled into the tight space with a measuring tape and flashlight, carefully determining where the cable could be relocated to achieve the required 6-inch separation from the engine control circuits. He had to account for the natural movement of the ship, ensuring that the cable wouldn't shift back toward the sensitive electronics when the vessel rolled or pitched in heavy seas. The first attempt to relocate the cable failed when they discovered that moving it to the specified position would interfere with a cooling system that had been installed after the communication upgrade. The cooling pipes occupied the space where the cable was supposed to go, creating a conflict that wasn't apparent in any of the ship's documentation. They had to develop a creative solution, routing the cable along a different path that maintained the required distance from the engine controls, while avoiding interference with other systems. This required fabricating custom mounting brackets and obtaining approval from multiple department heads who were responsible for the various systems in the area. Captain Mitchell grew increasingly anxious as the repair stretched into its second day. The ship was still vulnerable to engine failures, and weather reports showed a storm system moving into their area. Being caught in rough seas with unreliable engines could be catastrophic, and she felt the pressure of responsibility for her crew and their expensive vessel. Thompson worked methodically, double-checking every connection and ensuring that the cable was properly secured in its new position. He had seen too many quick fixes that created bigger problems, and he was determined to do the job right even if it took extra time. The crew watched nervously as he made final adjustments, knowing that their ability to get home safely depended on this elderly retired chief getting everything exactly right. The moment of truth came when they powered up the communication systems to test the new cable position. Petty Officer Martinez stood ready at his monitoring station, while Dr. Chen watched her interference detection equipment. Thompson positioned himself near the engine control panel, listening for any sounds that might indicate continuing problems. The first test message came from another Navy vessel in the area. Martinez saw the familiar pattern of radio signals on his displays, but this time, there was no static burst. Dr. Chen's electromagnetic interference detector remained quiet. Most importantly, the engines continued, running smoothly without any sign of the problems that had plagued them for weeks. They waited 9 minutes and 47 seconds, the exact delay, time that had preceded every previous engine failure. The engines ran normally. 10 minutes passed, then 15, then 30. For the first time in 3 weeks, the USS Charleston received radio communications without experiencing any engine problems. The crew began to cheer as word spread throughout the ship that the repair had apparently succeeded. But Thompson cautioned everyone to wait before celebrating. They needed to test the fix thoroughly, ensuring that it would work under all conditions and not just during calm seas with simple radio messages. Over the next 6 hours, they deliberately put the communication systems through extensive testing. They sent and received messages of various types and lengths, tested the emergency communication frequencies, and even activated some of the ship's most powerful radio transmitters. The engines continued to operate normally through every test. Dr. Chen was amazed by the results. "Chief Thompson, I have to admit I was skeptical of your theory. The idea that such a minor physical change could cause such major problems seemed impossible. But your fix has clearly worked. The electromagnetic interference readings have dropped to almost nothing." Thompson nodded but remained cautious. "Ma'am, we've solved the immediate problem, but this situation taught us something important about how these ships are maintained. A 2-inch change in cable position nearly stranded us in the middle of the ocean. We need to make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again." Captain Mitchell ordered the ship to begin making way toward home port, but at reduced speed initially, wanting to ensure the engines remained stable before committing to full power. As the USS Charleston started moving through the water under its own power for the first time in weeks, the crew felt a collective sense of relief and gratitude toward the unassuming retired chief who had solved a problem that had stumped the Navy's best experts. The USS Charleston made the journey back to San Diego without a single engine failure. What had been a nightmare voyage of uncertainty became a smooth transit across the Pacific, with the ship's engines running more reliably than they had in months. The crew's confidence returned as they watched their home port grow larger on the horizon, knowing they had survived a crisis that could have ended in disaster. Admiral Richardson was waiting on the pier when the ship docked. He had followed the entire situation from his headquarters, watching as his most expensive and sophisticated engineering teams failed to solve a problem that a retired chief petty officer had fixed in just 3 days. The admiral understood that this incident would require serious reflection on how the Navy approached complex technical problems. Thompson's solution had cost exactly nothing except the time required to move a cable 2 inches. The experts who had spent weeks aboard the ship had brought millions of dollars worth of diagnostic equipment and had run up enormous expenses in their failed attempts to identify the problem. Meanwhile, the answer had been hiding in plain sight, visible to someone who understood that mechanical problems often have simple causes. The story of the USS Charleston's engine problems became legendary within Navy engineering circles, though it was never publicly disclosed for security reasons. Officers and technicians shared the tale of how traditional diagnostic methods had failed, while old-fashioned observation and experience had saved the day. It became a cautionary story about the dangers of over-relying on sophisticated technology, while ignoring fundamental troubleshooting principles. Dr. Chen wrote a detailed report about the incident, recommending changes to ship maintenance procedures and diagnostic protocols. Her report emphasized the importance of documenting even minor modifications and ensuring that interactions between systems were properly evaluated. She also recommended that future engineering teams include experienced technicians who could provide perspectives that highly educated specialists might miss. Lieutenant Commander Park requested a transfer to work with Thompson on developing new training programs for Navy technicians. He had been humbled by watching the retired chief solve a problem that had defeated his engineering degree and years of specialized training. Park realized that there was still much he could learn from the older generation of sailors who had maintained ships before computers and sophisticated diagnostic equipment. The incident led to fleet-wide inspections of communication cable installations, revealing dozens of similar situations where cables had been moved slightly from their original positions during routine maintenance. While most of these deviations caused no problems, several ships were found to have potential interference issues that could have led to equipment failures under the right circumstances. Thompson returned to his quiet retirement in San Diego, declining offers to come back to active duty or work as a civilian contractor. He was satisfied with having helped his old ship and shipmates one more time, but he had no interest in making a career out of fixing other people's mistakes. He went back to restoring classic cars in his garage where problems were simpler and solutions didn't affect national security. Captain Mitchell kept in touch with Thompson after the incident, occasionally calling for advice when her ship encountered unusual technical problems. She had learned to value the perspective of experienced technicians and made sure her crew understood that sophistication and expertise weren't always the same thing. The best engineers, she realized, were often the ones who remembered that machines were built by humans and therefore subject to human errors and oversights. The communication cable that had caused so much trouble was eventually replaced during a scheduled maintenance period, eliminating even the possibility of future interference. But the lessons learned from the incident continued to influence Navy operations for years afterward. Training programs were modified to include more emphasis on observation and basic troubleshooting skills, ensuring that future generations of sailors would be equipped to handle problems that couldn't be solved by computers. Years later, when new officers asked about the importance of experience in engineering, they were often told the story of the USS Charleston and the retired chief who saved the ship by moving a cable 2 inches. It became a reminder that in a world of increasingly complex technology, sometimes the most important skill is simply knowing how to look and listen. The Navy's most sophisticated systems had failed to identify a problem that was solved by someone who understood that machines, like people, will usually tell you what's wrong if you pay attention to what they're trying to say. Thompson's toolkit, the same worn collection of simple instruments he had carried aboard the Charleston, was eventually donated to the Naval Academy Museum. It sits in a display case with a small plaque explaining how basic tools and experienced hands had accomplished what millions of dollars of advanced equipment could not. For young naval officers studying engineering, it serves as a reminder that technology is only as good as the people who use it, and that sometimes the best solution is also the simplest one.